Hello everybody, it's me, White Zulu, and welcome to another session from my autobiography of the same name. And in my background today, I've got frost in the valley, which by 10 o'clock is gone, but this was taken at 8 o'clock, just as I'm showing with my cursor, just as the sun touches the Intlizela, our own peak there. And this is the paddock in front of the house where the baboons eat the ryegrass, and there's the river running, and there's the bush. And as you can see, it's all snow white. And the reason I'm giving you this background today is because outside now, it's -6 degrees, and everything is white. It's called a freezing fog, and the sun doesn't penetrate, and every single leaf, cobweb, twig is covered in icicles, so much so that it looks like a winter wonderland. And it's rather nice, but unfortunately I can't show it to you, but I just thought I'd tell you about it. However, I'm going to tell you all about the remittance men. This is chapter 22 out of my autobiography. The remittance men. On my rides, when I crossed over Nunu Stream, which is the Wakefield boundary, I was faced with a choice. On the right, the red, hard-packed mud road, which leads up the steep hill to Wakefield House, and on the left, a big rusty metal gate, which opens onto a track in the veldt and leads through fields below the house, that's Wakefield House, and eventually to Stonycroft, the next farm along the valley. Right next to the gate on the left is where the wattles grow thickest. Now there's nothing more spooky than wattle plantations, as, to start with, the trunks are all pitch black, and their densely clustered little leaves are very dark green. They grow as thick as hair on a dog's back, and even on the sunniest days manage to shut out all the light, creating a sense of gloom. Silence adds to the eeriness. In the natural bush, at any time of the day, there are bird calls or the clattering of doves' wings as they flutter about in the treetops. Even the chatter of monkeys or murmurs from a troop of foraging baboons give the impression that the place is alive with creatures. But here, because the wattles are alien species from Australia and a monoculture, nothing grows with or under them. They render the ground and their surroundings sterile and provide no food for indigenous wildlife. So there, in the deep shade, there's an eerie silence. At night, especially when the mist comes down and threads through the wattle trees, there is no place more terrifyingly spooky. Of course, we never went out at night unless it was driving home from a polo tournament, and I watched the wattle plantations from the safety of the back seat of the car, giving myself thrills of terror as I imagined what it might be like to be out there by myself. The chill, silent, pitch-black night, the sinister trees, and the fact that there could be big wild animals, such as leopards, lurking in among the mist which swirls around those cold black trunks, made me shudder with horror. Even now, today, in broad daylight, when the sun was blazing down, riding through the cool, dark shade of the wattles left me feeling cold and uneasy. To add to the sinister atmosphere, there were, to the left of the gate, the remains of a hut called Billy Simpson's hut. The ruined hut, just a short walk up from the river, had young wattle saplings growing out of it, which gave me the creeps, especially as I knew the story behind it from Grandpa. Billy Simpson had been a remittance man in the 1940s, 10 years before I was born, during the time that my grandparents were running the farm, while my father dropped bombs on the Italians in North America. Remittance men were the black sheep from well-off and often aristocratic families in England, who, when their wayward antics became too much for their parents or siblings to bear, were given a one-way ticket on a steamship to the colonies such as South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. Even India and Malaysia had their remittance men. Filth was a common acronym for these pariahs, meaning finished in London, try Hong Kong. These outcasts, now and again, there were women who'd blotted their copybooks too, were given regular sums of money, but never enough for the return journey, to stay in their allocated colonies, too far away to be stirring up any more scandals on their home turf. In my grandparents' time, there were several remittance men in our district, and it was through Grandpa that we learned the history of the Hempsons. Billy and his brother. Sometime in the early 1940s, they had arrived at Wakefield, two young Englishmen who'd been educated at an expensive public school. It's what they call private schools here in England. Still well spoken, but with long bushy beards and wild hair, with a boy of roughly 10 years old, the same age as I was now, who must have been Billy's son. They built themselves a wattle and daub hut near the Umgeni River, thatched it with long grass from the hillside, and settled there, living on brown trout they caught in the river, with flies they made from guinea fowl feathers. The two men and the young boy twisted wire snares to trap rabbits in the veld and small antelope in the bush, and occasionally they stole a goat from the Zulu settlement across the river in the dead of night. They would slit its throat, bring the carcass back across the river, skin and butcher it, and put it in a big black three-legged cast iron pot they'd brought with them when they arrived from God knows where, to stew over an open fire. They spent their days lying up in the gullies, reading novels brought by the travelling salesman and shooting hardy-dars, big raucous ibis for the pot. My grandparents only heard about the goat episodes through the travelling salesman. This was a man who came all the way out to the scattered ranches in our district, riding on the seat of an ox wagon full of books, which he sold to the farmers. On the bookshelves at home, we had, and still have, a set of American illustrated Bible stories, which had been bought from his stock, and which had brightly coloured plates of beaming little boys and girls who had dropped to their knees in roads and muddy fields, and who prayed earnestly to Jesus, their tiny hands clasped together, their faces raised to heaven, and their eyes tight shut. The boys wore short shorts and white ankle socks, and the girls all had neat, tight pigtails or plaits, short dresses with pinnies and white ankle socks. Paying our farm a visit, the travelling salesman continued on down to Mgeni Port, which was a cattle ranch before the Catholic Church bought it for the nuns, and finally Wakefield, where the road eventually petered out and where the Hempson brothers had built their makeshift mud hut. He parked his wagon full of books, turned his team of oxen out to graze next to the river, and spent a night or two there. According to Grandpa, he was more than surprised to be offered a supper of goat stew, and after the brothers had imbibed a few brandies from the salesman's stock, was told the source of the meat. I tried to picture the three men, the Hempsons, well, men and boy, dressed in tattered khaki with homemade shoes, velskens made from buckskin, their wild bushy beards and long hair, sitting around a campfire, smoking their pipes, drinking brandy from tin mugs and talking, while the thin, ragged boy sat with them, gnawing on a piece of goat meat. In order to collect their remittance money, Billy Hempson and his brother had to ride on horseback 15 miles to the Nottingham Road post office, which was just a tin-roofed shed with a front stoop held up by two wooden posts. It's pretty much like that now, except it's shut. They owned or borrowed 3 small shaggy Basutu ponies, which they saddled up on payday, and taking the 10-year-old boy with them, rode off at first light to make the long trek to the post office. Once they had collected their money, wired there by their parents or other relatives in cash from the postmaster, it was just a mere couple of 100 yards across the railway line to the Nottingham Road Hotel, where there was a thriving and very busy bar. That hasn't changed. Later that night, when the 2 men had eventually been thrown out by the bartender who wanted to lock up and go to bed, they would be uproariously drunk, and most of the remittance money had been spent. The small boy had to somehow load them back onto their ponies and, leading them both on a long rein, plod home in the pitch dark all the way back beyond our farm and Mgeni Port, and eventually down to their hut next to the river. I don't know if the young boy had any sort of lantern, not according to Grandpa anyway, but he had to ride unarmed with those 2 dead drunk men slung sideways over their saddles through Lion's Bush. The area was no longer infested with lions after farmers like Grandpa, it wasn't him though, had shot them all. The last lion shot was back in about 1846 by a Boer settler, Gert Maritz, who owned the farm called Lion's Bush, still called Lion's Bush. He was the brother or cousin, no one seems sure, of Piet Maritz, who found what used to be called Pietermaritzburg, now Umgunguntlov. There's a well-known story that Maritz and some pals shot 5 lions before breakfast one morning in the vlei below Lion's Bush. There were certainly leopards about, there still are. Every rustle in the grass in the pitch dark on his long, long trudge home must have made the small Hemson boy jump. Hearing all this from most Zulu herdsmen and the travelling salesman, felt sorry, or often felt sorry for the remittance men, especially the little boy. And she would organise for her induna to take an ox wagon down to the Hemsons' hut with some mealie meal, fresh milk, and a few groceries like tea and sugar, just so that they wouldn't starve to death, having blown all their money on booze. On one occasion, possibly at the end of winter, after things had become so dire that they had run out of food of any kind and were beginning to look emaciated, my grandmother wrote a letter to Billy's family in England, asking them to send more money urgently. She told them that it was an emergency, and the family complied. The brothers had some money left over after their windfall payoff, even after their usual drinking orgy at the Notties pub, and they threw a party for their neighbours, inviting our grandparents down to their hut in the Wattles. They presented my grandmother with a gift, a large, solid brass ashtray in a sort of Art Deco style, which stands on a table in our sitting room and has done as long as I can remember. It must have cost the Hemsons quite a bit to buy and have it sent up from our nearest town, Pietermaritzburg, and no doubt they must have regretted it the next month when they were broke again, and it would be a long time before they'd receive their next remittance payoff. Some remittance men drifted back to England, but nobody knows what became of Billy Hemson, his brother, or the boy after the war. They slipped away, leaving the hut to decay and be reclaimed by wattle saplings. Now, as I've said before, I'm shortening my readings because you guys are suffering from load shedding and it's chewing up your batteries to listen to it. So that's enough for this session. This is the story of the remittance men. And I want to thank John Moslane very much for helping me do these videos, enabling us to make them. And if you'd like to visit my website, www.whitezulubook.com, you'll find plenty more information and photographs there. Thank you so much for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Little piece of history, which very few people know about now. And I'll see you next time. Goodbye.